October 26, 1947, New York Harbor. A converted Liberty ship called the USAT Joseph E. Connolly is easing toward the dock, and in her hold are 6,248 steel caskets. The war she is carrying the dead from has been over for more than 2 years. Germany surrendered in May of 1945. Japan surrendered in September. The victory parades happened long ago, and yet here is a ship, in the fall of 1947, still delivering the fallen home from a war everyone thinks has already been fully buried, in every sense of the word. A band on the pier begins playing Chopin's Funeral March. One casket is chosen at random from the thousands in the hold. It is lowered onto a horse-drawn caisson. 6,000 marchers from every branch of the military escorted up Fifth Avenue to Central Park, where military chaplains and government dignitaries wait beside the sheep meadow. 400,000 people line the streets in silence to watch one anonymous casket go by, standing in for all 6,248 of them. 16 days earlier, on the other side of the country, a different ship called the Honda Knot had docked in Oakland, California, carrying 3,027 caskets from the Pacific, while a military band played taps and Verdi's Requiem. These 2 ships were the beginning of something that had never been attempted before at this scale in the history of warfare. Over the next 4 years, the United States government would search dozens of countries and territories across 6 continents, disinter tens of thousands of temporary graves, identify men by fingerprints and dental records and scraps of dog tag, and then physically transport more than 171,000 individual bodies back across oceans to the towns they came from. Historians estimate the total cost somewhere between $163 and $191 million, depending on which government accounting you read. An enormous sum at the time. No other major combatant nation carried out a government repatriation program on this scale. Britain did not repatriate. Germany did not. The Soviet Union did not. Only the United States looked at hundreds of thousands of war dead and told every single family, "It is your choice, and we will carry out whatever you decide, no matter what it costs us." This is the story of how that promise was made, why almost nobody else on Earth made it, and what it actually took to keep it. To understand why America did this, you have to go back to a much smaller war and a much smaller number of dead. In the spring of 1917, as the United States prepared to send soldiers to France for the first time, General John J. Pershing understood something that the peacetime army had never had to plan for at scale. Modern industrial war was going to kill more Americans farther from home than anything in the nation's history. On May 31, 1917, Pershing requested that a retired Army chaplain named Charles C. Pierce be recalled to active duty. Pierce had handled burial and identification work years earlier in the Philippines, and he was, in effect, the only man in the American military who had ever thought seriously about what to do with the dead of an overseas war. On August 7, 1917, the Graves Registration Service was formally organized. Pierce arrived in France with 2 officers and about 50 enlisted men. By the time the war ended, 19 quartermaster Graves registration companies were operating across the front, and the service had supervised more than 73,000 temporary burials. The men who did this work went into places no one else wanted to go. Pershing himself later wrote about one unit that, in the spring of 1918, began its work under heavy shell fire and gas, refusing to leave a cemetery even while the men around it were sheltering in dugouts. That was the standard the Graves Registration Service set for itself. From its very first year, no risk was too great if it meant a soldier's remains could be identified rather than lost. When the war ended, America faced a decision that every combatant nation had to face, and almost every nation answered differently. More than 70,000 American dead were scattered in roughly 23,000 burial sites across France, Belgium, and beyond. Britain had already answered its version of this question. The Imperial War Graves Commission, founded in 1917 under a man named Fabian Ware, decided that British and Commonwealth dead of every rank would be buried permanently where they fell, in identical government headstones, with no repatriation allowed to anyone of any class. The reasoning was equality. A general and a private would lie under the same stone, and no family could buy its way to a different outcome by shipping a body home. It provoked real anger. Petitions flooded the British Parliament. Families argued they had a right to bury their own son on their own soil. The policy held anyway. General Pershing, for his part, personally leaned toward a similar instinct. He cabled Washington after the war, offering his own opinion that if the American dead could speak for themselves, they would probably prefer to stay buried beside their comrades. It was a personal view, not a policy he tried to impose. The French government, still trying to rebuild a shattered country, quietly hoped for the same outcome. A mass American exhumation and repatriation effort would have competed for the very trains, ports, and labor France needed for its own recovery. Marshal Philippe Pétain personally assured Pershing that France would honor the American dead forever if they were allowed to remain. But something different happened in the United States than had happened in Britain. American families, many of them represented by an increasingly organized movement of mothers who had lost sons in the war, pushed back hard on the idea that the government could simply decide, on their behalf, that their son would never come home. And the United States government, unlike the British government, gave in. Every family of a World War I American dead was given an individual choice. Leave your son in a permanent overseas military cemetery that the country would maintain forever, or bring him home. It was slower, messier, and more expensive than the British model, and it was personal in a way the British model deliberately was not. That choice, offered family by family, rather than legislated for an entire empire at once, became the American template. Nobody knew yet that it would have to be used again, at a scale nobody in 1918 could have imagined. When the Second World War began, the Graves Registration Service was folded into the Army Quartermaster Corps and rebuilt almost from nothing. New soldiers arriving at Fort Warren, Wyoming, in November of 1943 were simply told they were being assigned to a GR outfit and left to guess what that meant. Some guessed guerrilla raiders. They liked the sound of that. The next day, their commanding officer, Captain Thomas Roundtree, told the men of the newly formed 612th Graves Registration Company what GR actually stood for. One private who was in that room, Thomas Dowling, remembered the sound of the men around him sucking in their breath. It was, in his words, a job everyone assumed someone else would have to do. The men of the Graves Registration Companies followed the combat divisions ashore, sometimes within hours of the landing itself. The 607th Quartermaster Graves Registration Company came ashore near Omaha Beach and established a temporary American cemetery on the 10th of June, 1944, 4 days after WWII, at a site called La Combe. Across the whole of the European and Pacific theaters, this work followed the same grim procedure everywhere. The dead were brought to what the men called a stripping line, where explosives and equipment were carefully removed. Personal effects were cataloged so they could eventually be returned to a family, and identification was attempted through dog tags, fingerprints, and dental records. When identification was not possible, the remains were given an X number instead of a name and wrapped in a mattress cover, since bedsheets and proper shrouds were almost always in short supply at the front. In the days after the Battle of the Bulge, soldiers of the 607th were among those who processed the frozen bodies of 84 American prisoners murdered near Normandy, Belgium, gathering the evidence that would later be used in the war crimes trials of the men responsible. One soldier who did that work, a man named Little, remembered that the bodies had frozen so quickly after the killing that when they finally began to thaw weeks later, they bled again, as if freshly shot. Major Merwin de Corp, of the 46th Graves Registration Company, later summed up why his men did this work with such care, even under fire, even in conditions that would break most people. He said it came down to giving the fallen the most dignified burial that circumstances allowed. It was not abstract patriotism. It was a practical obligation, carried out one body at a time, day after day, for years. The war ended in 1945, but for the Graves Registration Service, that was only the halfway point. What began 6 months after VJ Day was one of the largest search and recovery operations for the dead in military history. In Europe, the search covered roughly 1.5 million square miles of territory, complicated by the rapidly hardening lines of the emerging Cold War, which made parts of Soviet-controlled Germany and Eastern Europe difficult or impossible to access. In the Pacific, the search meant combing remote islands and dense jungle for isolated graves and aircraft crash sites that had gone unmarked since the moment they happened. By the time the effort concluded, the United States had recovered or accounted for approximately 280,000 American dead. Then came the choice. In 1946, Congress authorized what became known as the Return of the Dead program. Every family of record received a government pamphlet called Disposition of World War, the Second Armed Forces Dead, followed by a Form 345, that laid out the options in plain bureaucratic language. The remains could be interred permanently in an American military cemetery overseas, cared for forever by the newly created American Battle Monuments Commission, or they could be returned to the United States for burial in a private cemetery, in a national cemetery, or even shipped to a foreign country that had been the soldier's own homeland. If a family chose repatriation, the government would deliver the casket by military hearse to the nearest train station or directly to the family's home, and would pay up to $600 toward a private funeral. President Harry Truman, in a public statement on May 13, 1947, tried gently to nudge families toward leaving their sons overseas, pointing out how beautifully the temporary cemeteries were already being maintained, and suggesting the government instead fund pilgrimage trips for families to visit the graves in person. That pilgrimage proposal was judged too expensive and was quietly dropped. Truman's nudge did not work either. When the final numbers were tallied, more than 171,000 families, over 60%, chose to bring their soldier home. The remaining roughly 110,000 families chose to leave their loved ones overseas, and those men were consolidated into 14 permanent cemeteries that the American Battle Monuments Commission still maintains today, cemeteries like Normandy, overlooking Omaha Beach, and Margraten in the Netherlands, where local Dutch families still formally adopt individual American graves. That tradition began when a teenage girl named Frida van Schaik wrote to the American military in 1945, simply asking that the boys be left with her town and promising they would never be forgotten. The scale of the logistics behind either choice was staggering. A shortage of steel and casket-making material after the war meant the disinterment and shipping process stretched from 1947 all the way to 1951, and, in some cases later, each identified soldier was placed into a sealed steel casket with a bronze finish, 32 lugs holding a rubber gasket in place to seal it, and the casket itself was placed inside a wooden shipping case stenciled with the man's name, rank, and serial number. Ships like the Joseph V. Connolly and the Honda Knot were essentially converted into floating funeral processions, crossing oceans with holds full of the dead instead of cargo. Behind every one of those steel cases was a family whose war did not end in 1945. Corporal Delbert Truman was killed on the 17th of October 1944 when the B-24 bomber he was in was shot down over Vienna. His pilot, First Lieutenant Leonard Mojica, 21 years old and his mother's only child, died in the same crash. Mojica's mother, Juanita Harding, spent years afterward pleading with military officials to bring her son home, at one point offering to sell her own trailer home to help pay whatever it cost. Not every journey home was simple, even after a family made its choice. An infantryman named Themistocles Zombas, killed by shell fragments on the 18th of March 1945 just after his unit crossed the Rhine, was originally buried near Henri-Chapelle, Belgium, the largest wartime American cemetery in Europe. When the repatriation program began in 1947, Henri-Chapelle was the very first cemetery emptied. and Zombas's remains were among the roughly 5,000 loaded onto the Joseph V. Connolly for that first historic voyage into New York Harbor. His parents, Daniel and Giacomo Zombas, then decided in 1949 that they wanted their son buried in the family's original homeland of Greece instead, and had him disinterred and shipped a second time. Then, only 8 months later, they changed their minds again, brought him back to Massachusetts a third time, and finally buried him for good in April of 1950, 5 years and 4 burials after the day he died. It was an unusual case, but the grief behind it was not. Now hold that image next to what was happening on the other side of the same battlefields. Germany's own version of a war grave service, the Volksbund Deutsche Kriegsgräberfürsorge, founded as a private citizens' charity back in 1919, operated on a principle that was essentially the mirror opposite of the American one. German war dead were, and still are, buried where they fell. There was never a program to bring the Wehrmacht's fallen home, never a form asking a German mother whether she wanted her son's body shipped back to Munich or Hamburg. During the war itself, this work fell to the Wehrmacht's own internal grave service rather than any civilian organization, and after Germany's total defeat in 1945, the shattered post-war German state had neither the money, the shipping, nor the international standing to attempt anything like America's repatriation program, even if it had wanted to. Millions of German dead, especially the roughly 3 million lost across the Eastern Front, would spend decades, some still remain to this day, unlocated, uncounted, or resting exactly where they had fallen, under crosses arranged in vast communal fields, rather than individual marked graves shipped home to a family. There is one small piece of ground in Normandy that captures this entire contrast better than any statistic can. Near Omaha Beach sits a cemetery called La Combe. Today it is the largest German war cemetery in Normandy, holding more than 21,000 German dead. But La Combe did not start out German. It started out as an American cemetery, established by the 607th Graves Registration Company 4 days after WWII, in June of 1944. Until 1947, American soldiers lay in that ground. Then, as part of the Return of the Dead program, their remains were exhumed and either shipped home or moved to the new permanent American cemetery nearby. Only after the Americans had taken their dead out of that soil did the site pass to German hands, in 1948, eventually becoming the resting place, under a formal 1954 agreement between France and West Germany, for more than 12,000 German soldiers gathered in from roughly 1,400 scattered field graves across Normandy. The same patch of earth tells both stories side by side, the country that emptied a cemetery to bring its sons home, and the country that filled the same ground permanently, because it had no other choice, and, in truth, no other tradition to draw on. None of this was really about death. It was about a promise a democracy made to its own citizens in the middle of the 20th century, that if a family sent their son overseas to fight, and he did not come back alive, the government would still, eventually, ask them what they wanted, and would spend whatever it took, in money, ships, steel, and years of labor, to carry that answer out. Britain, with its Imperial War Graves Commission, decided that equality among the dead mattered more than the individual wishes of any one family, and enforced that decision uniformly across an empire. Germany never had the resources for the question at all. Only the United States built an entire post-war government program, run for 4 years by the Quartermaster Corps, whose sole purpose was to ask 171,000 individual families the same simple question, and then act on whatever they said. The men who did the asking, and the digging, and the identifying were never treated as heroes in the way infantrymen and pilots were. Their work rarely appeared in wartime newsreels. The privates who arrived at Fort Warren in 1943, hoping for something like guerrilla raiders, and instead got graves registration work, mostly went home after the war and rarely spoke about what they had seen on the stripping line, in the same way that so many combat veterans of every kind chose silence over explanation. But the promise they carried out, quietly, methodically, one Form 345 and one steel casket at a time, was as uniquely American as anything else that came out of that war. If you have a family story connected to the Graves Registration Service in either World War, I would be honored to read it in the comments. The unit, the theater, the name of the soldier who came home, or the one who stayed. Those details are the actual record of what this program meant, and they deserve to be kept alive by the people who still carry them. Like this video if the story of the Return of the Dead was new to you, and subscribe if you want more of the system's history quietly leaves out. There are more of these stories. Most of them are about ordinary people who decided that a promise, once made, had to be kept.